In the winter of 1859, along the frost-covered fields of Rutherford County, North Carolina, a plantation master named Colonel Thaddeus Wainwright orchestrated a dinner that would become whispered legend among the enslaved communities of the South. A grotesque banquet where the boundaries between hospitality and horror dissolved into madness, where a woman named Ruth sat at a table set not for celebration, but for her own psychological destruction. You are now entering shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, narratives that reveal the depths of moral collapse hidden beneath the veneer of gentility and grace. Colonel Thaddeus Wainwright was 47 years old in that fateful winter, a man of considerable education who had studied briefly at the College of William and Mary before inheriting his father's tobacco plantation, Ashwood Manor, in 1843. The property stretched across nearly 800 acres of rolling Piedmont land, worked by approximately 230 enslaved men, women, and children. Wainwright was known throughout Rutherford County as a man of peculiar temperament, outwardly refined, versed in classical literature and theology, yet subject to what his physician termed melancholic fits, and what his neighbors more quietly called episodes of unhinged obsession. He had never married, a fact that raised eyebrows in a society where matrimony and legitimate heirs were essential to a man's standing. His sister, Constance, had lived with him until her death from consumption in 1857, leaving him alone in the great house with only the enslaved to witness his increasingly erratic behavior. Ruth was 26 years old that winter, a woman of mixed heritage whose mother had been brought to Ashwood from a plantation in eastern Virginia. Ruth possessed what the records of the time would have coldly described as refined features, evidence of white ancestry that was never acknowledged but always visibly. She had been taught to read by Colonel Wainwright's late sister, a transgression of law that Constance had justified through selective interpretation of scripture. Ruth worked primarily in the main house, managing the kitchen operations and overseeing the preparation of meals. She was the mother of 2 children, a boy of 8 named Samuel, and a daughter of 5 named Lily, both fathered by an enslaved carpenter named Saved Carpenter named Saya, who had been sold away to a plantation in South Carolina 3 years prior. The sale had been sudden, without warning or explanation, leaving Ruth to raise her children in the shadow of that abandonment. The plantation's key workers included Moses, a man of 52 who served as the head field driver, his authority among the enslaved second only to the white overseer, Clara, 40 years old, who had been Ruth's mother's closest friend and now served as a midwife and healer, Benjamin, a young man of 19, who worked in the tobacco barns and possessed a dangerous tendency toward defiance, Dina, 34, who managed the laundry and had lost 3 of her 5 children to Sally, Hannah, 16, newly assigned to housework and still learning the intricate codes of survival. In proximity to the master, Jacob, 61, the eldest among them, a man whose body had been broken by decades of labor, but whose memory held the stories of 2 generations, Sarah, 23, who worked the fields despite having given birth only months before, and Thomas, 14, who served as a stable hand and messenger boy, moving between the world of the enslaved quarters and the great house with the uncertain status of adolescence. The triggering event arrived in November of 1858, when Colonel Wainwright received a letter from a distant cousin in Charleston. The correspondence brought news that another branch of the Wainwright family had successfully challenged a will, claiming a large portion of an estate on the grounds that the deceased had been of unsound mind when the document was drafted. The implications were clear. Without legitimate heirs, without a wife to cement his lineage, Thaddeus Wainwright's own legacy hung in precarious balance. He became obsessed with the question of succession, with the problem of his isolation, with what he perceived as the cosmic injustice of his solitude. In a society where a man's worth was measured in land, slaves, and sons, he possessed the first two but lacked the third that would give meaning to the others. It was during this period of deepening melancholy that Wainwright began to fixate on Ruth. She had been part of his household for nearly 15 years, a constant presence whose competence and quiet dignity had made her indispensable. But now he saw her through a different lens, one distorted by his isolation and his desperate need to impose an order on a life that felt increasingly meaningless. He convinced himself that there existed between them an understanding, a mutual recognition of each other's intelligence and suffering. He began to speak to her during the preparation of his evening meals, sharing his thoughts on philosophy and theology, quoting from books she had secretly read under his sister's tutelage. Ruth understood the danger immediately. There was no safety in being noticed, no protection in being elevated above one's station. But she had no choice except to listen, to nod, to maintain the careful performance of deference that survival required. The invitation came in early December. Colonel Wainwright informed Ruth that she would join him for dinner on Christmas Eve, that they would dine together in the formal dining room as equals, that this would be a gesture of recognition for her years of loyal service. He presented this not as a command, but as an honor, though both understood the fiction of choice. Ruth's initial reaction was one of pure terror. To sit at the master's table was to cross a boundary that could only lead to destruction, either immediate punishment for presumption or something worse, the creation of an obligation that could never be fulfilled, a debt that would be extracted from her flesh and her children's future. She confided in Clara, who advised her to feign illness, but Moses, when consulted, saw the situation more clearly. If Ruth refused, the colonel's wounded pride would turn to rage, and there was no predicting what form that rage might take. The only path forward was through the nightmare itself. Pause for a moment and reflect. In a system where even the smallest gesture of humanity could be transformed into a weapon, where kindness itself was often the prelude to cruelty, what choice did the enslaved truly possess? Every action, every word, every silence carried the weight of impossible calculation. The weeks leading to Christmas Eve were filled with dread. Ruth continued her duties, preparing meals and managing the household, while knowing that the dinner would fundamentally alter her position on the plantation. The other enslaved workers watched with a mixture of sympathy and fear, understanding that Ruth's elevation, no matter how illusory, could only bring suffering. Benjamin, the young tobacco worker, spoke openly about the wrongness of it, about the master's sickness, until Moses silenced him with a look that carried decades of survival wisdom. To speak such things was to invite a disaster not just upon oneself, but upon the entire community. Colonel Wainwright made elaborate preparations. He ordered the finest china and crystal to be brought from storage, items that had not been used since his sister's death. He selected wine from his cellar, bottles that had been aging for years. He instructed Ruth on what she should wear, a dress that had belonged to Constance, altered to fit her frame. Each detail was designed to create the illusion of normalcy, to transform a plantation dining room in the North Carolina Piedmont into a space where the fundamental reality of enslavement could be temporarily suspended. But the illusion required Ruth's participation, her willingness to perform a role that made a mockery of her actual condition. Christmas Eve arrived with unusual cold, a frost that coated the tobacco fields and made the enslaved quarters seem even more vulnerable against the winter wind. Ruth, dressed in the modified gown, her hands shaking as Clara helped with the buttons. Her children watched in confused silence, too young to fully understand, but old enough to sense their mother's fear. Before leaving for the great house, Ruth knelt before them and told them that she loved them, a statement that carried the weight of potential goodbye. Clara promised to watch over them, her eyes reflecting the helplessness they all felt. The dining room had been transformed. Candles illuminated the long table, their light and reflecting of polished silver and crystal. Colonel Wainwright stood near the fireplace, dressed in his finest evening clothes, a grotesque parody of aristocratic hospitality. He greeted Ruth with formal courtesy, offering his arm to escort her to her chair, as though she were a visiting dignitary, rather than a woman he owned. The performance had begun, and both actors understood their roles even as they recognized the fundamental obscenity of the script. The meal consisted of multiple courses: oyster soup brought from the coast, roasted duck with blackberry sauce, potatoes prepared with cream and butter, vegetables from the winter stores, and finally a pudding flavored with brandy and spices. Each dish had been prepared by Ruth herself over the preceding days, an additional layer of absurdity to the evening. She sat at the table eating food she had cooked, served by Hannah, the 16-year-old house girl, who moved through the room with downcast eyes, her presence a reminder of the reality that Wainwright's fantasy sought to deny. Throughout the meal, the colonel spoke continuously. He discussed philosophy, quoting from Plato and Augustine. He talked about the burden of stewardship, about his responsibility for the souls under his care. He offered theological justifications for slavery that twisted scripture into notes of self-serving logic. He spoke about loneliness, about the oscillation of command, about how Constance's death had left him without companionship equal to his intellect. And then, as the brandy flowed more freely, he began to speak about Ruth herself, about her intelligence, her dignity, her irreplaceable role in his household. He spoke about recognition, about gratitude, about a bond that transcended the crude distinctions of society. Ruth maintained her silence through most of this monologue, offering only the minimal responses the courtesy required. She understood that the colonel was constructing a narrative, building toward some revelation or demand that had not yet been spoken. The meal stretched on for hours, each course another act in a play whose ending remained unclear but certainly tragic. When Wainwright finally dismissed Hannah, sending her back to the quarters, Ruth felt her terror crystallize into certainty. Whatever was coming would happen in the privacy of this room, witnessed only by the portraits of Wainwright ancestors that lined the walls. The colonel's proposal, when it finally came, was delivered with the earnestness of a man who believed himself to be offering something valuable. He suggested that Ruth become his companion in a formal sense, that she move into rooms adjacent to his own, that she take on the role his sister had once filled, but with additional considerations. He spoke about the benefits this arrangement would bring: better quarters, freedom from field work for her children, perhaps even manumission papers upon his death. He presented it as though he were negotiating a contract between equals, as though Ruth possessed the power to refuse, as though the entire edifice of slavery did not render every word a lie. If you wish to continue receiving stories that excavate the buried horrors and moral catastrophes of the American South, stories that refuse to let history remain sanitized and forgotten, subscribe to Shadows of the South and join us in bearing witness to these testimonies of suffering and survival. Ruth's response has been preserved in a remarkable way, not through written records from that night, but through the oral history passed down through her descendants and recorded by a northern missionary teacher during Reconstruction. According to these accounts, Ruth did not immediately refuse. Instead, she asked the colonel a single question: whether her children would be truly free, whether they would be educated, whether they would be protected from Sale. Wainwright, emboldened by what he interpreted as negotiation rather than desperation, made sweeping promises. He would see to their education himself. He would include provisions for them in his will. They would want for nothing. In a society where even motherhood was property, where the love a woman bore for her children could be leveraged as a weapon against her, what choice could possibly be called free? The enslaved lived in a world where every decision was made under the shadow of violence, where every relationship was poisoned by the fundamental inequality that rendered consent itself impossible. Ruth requested time to consider, a delay that Wainwright granted with what he believed to be magnanimity. She returned to the quarters in the early hours of Christmas morning, the modified dress stained with wine and candle wax, her face unreadable. The community gathered to hear what had transpired, and Ruth, in a voice that Clara would later describe as eerily calm, explained the colonel's proposal and the promises he had made. The response was unanimous. There was no promise a master could make that was worth believing, no contract that could not be dissolved at his whim, no protection that was not illusory. But Ruth was already thinking several moves ahead. She understood that outright refusal would endanger not just herself, but her children and possibly others. She needed to accept in a way that would ultimately make the arrangement impossible for Wainwright himself to sustain. Over the next several days, she formulated her response, consulting with Moses and Clara, drawing on their collective wisdom about the psychology of masters and the mechanisms of survival. When she met with Colonel Wainwright again, Ruth accepted his proposal, but with conditions that seemed reasonable on their surface. She requested that the arrangement be announced publicly, that their status be recognized in the sight of God and community. She asked that he speak with the Presbyterian minister about a blessing, that he informed the neighboring plantation owners of his intentions. She framed these requests as matters of her own dignity and Christian propriety, knowing that what she was actually doing was forcing Wainwright to confront the social consequences of his fantasy. In the privacy of his dining room, he could convince himself that their arrangement would be understood as a civilized accommodation. But to speak of it openly, to seek ecclesiastical sanction, to make explicit what was supposed to remain unspoken, this would expose him to the judgment of his peers and the censor of his church. Colonel Wainwright initially agreed, still confident in his ability to navigate the social complexities. He arranged a meeting with Reverend Hosea Blackwood, the minister of the Rutherford Presbyterian Church, to discuss what he carefully termed a domestic arrangement requiring spiritual counsel. The meeting was a disaster. Reverend Blackwood, a man of conventional piety and acute sensitivity to social norms, understood immediately what Wainwright was proposing and was horrified not by the reality of sexual exploitation, such things were common enough, but by the colonel's desire to formalize and sanctify it. The minister's response was unequivocal. Such an arrangement could never receive church blessing. The very suggestion was scandalous, and if Colonel Wainwright persisted in this course, his standing in the congregation would be irreparably damaged. Word of the meeting spread with remarkable speed. By early January, rumors circulated throughout Rutherford County. The story that emerged in drawing rooms and church gatherings was one of a master gone mad, a man so isolated and eccentric that he sought to marry his slave, to elevate a woman of mixed race to the position of mistress of Ashwood Manor. The details became increasingly distorted with each retelling, but the core scandal remained consistent. Colonel Thaddeus Wainwright had violated the unspoken rules that allowed the system of slavery to function. Masters could exploit enslaved women with impunity, could father children who would themselves become property, but they could never acknowledge these relationships openly, could never mistake power for affection or ownership for partnership. The social consequences were swift and severe. Neighboring plantation owners began to distance themselves, declining invitations and offering transparent excuses. The Wainwright family's attorney traveled from Charlotte to assess the situation and deliver a message from more prominent relatives. If Thaddeus did not abandon this madness, they would move to have him declared incompetent and take control of his property. The threat was existential. Not only his reputation, but his very ownership of Ashwood Manor was at stake. Women of his social class, who had previously tolerated his eccentricities as the acceptable peculiarities of a confirmed bachelor now viewed him with disgust and refused to acknowledge him in public spaces. Ruth watched this unfolding catastrophe with grim satisfaction. She had not sought to destroy Colonel Wainwright, but she had understood that forcing him to confront the social reality of his fantasy would make the arrangement untenable. She had weaponized the very system that oppressed her, using the slave-holding class's own rules and hypocrisies against one of its members. But victory, in such circumstances, was always provisional and dangerous. Consider the mathematics of survival. To win against power, the powerless must often sacrifice themselves, must transform their own destruction into a weapon. Ruth understood that her strategy would bring consequences, that even in victory she would suffer, but she chose the suffering that preserved her children's future over the suffering that would have destroyed them utterly. By February, Colonel Wainwright's mental state had deteriorated dramatically. The man who had once prided himself on rationality and classical learning now alternated between rage and despair. He blamed Ruth for his humiliation, convinced himself that she had deliberately manipulated him and exposed him to ridicule. He called her to the great house repeatedly, sometimes to berate her, other times to plead with her to somehow undo the damage, to help him restore his reputation by claiming publicly that she had misunderstood his intentions, that no improper proposal had ever been made. Ruth refused, maintaining a careful silence that neither confirmed nor denied the various rumors, but allowed the scandal to continue its corrosive work. The colonel's response was to retreat from society entirely. He stopped attending church, refused visitors, and spent increasing amounts of time alone in his study. The plantation's operations suffered as he neglected the practical management of tobacco cultivation and focused instead on elaborate written justifications for his actions, documents that mixed theological reasoning with personal grievance and rambling philosophical speculation. The overseer, a man named Dalton, who had worked at Ashwood for 12 years, began to make decisions without consulting Wainwright, effectively running the plantation by default. It was during this period that the colonel conceived of his final, terrible gesture. If society refused to recognize his vision, If the church denied him blessing, if his own family threatened to declare him mad, then he would demonstrate through one ultimate act the sincerity of his beliefs and the depth of his commitment. On the evening of March 15, 1859, Colonel Thaddeus Wainwright organized a second dinner, but this time the guest list was expanded. He ordered that Ruth be brought to the great house along with her children, Samuel and Lily. He instructed that Moses, Clara, Benjamin, Dinah, Hannah, Jacob, Sarah, and Thomas also be present. He commanded that the formal dining room be set with every place of china and crystal the house possessed, that a feast be prepared using the plantation's remaining winter stores. When the enslaved community assembled in the great house that evening, confused and terrified by the unprecedented summons, they found Colonel Wainwright standing in the dining room dressed in funeral attire, his finest black suit, a black cravat, black gloves. The table had been set for a banquet, but the atmosphere was that of a wake. Wainwright instructed them all to sit, to take their places at the table as equals, to partake in the meal he had prepared, though in truth it was food they had grown, harvested, and cooked, now offered back to them as though it were a gift. What followed was hours of surreal horror. The colonel served the meal himself, moving around the table with rigid formality, filling plates and glasses while delivering a monologue that mixed scripture with confession, apology with accusation. He spoke about his failures, about the system that had corrupted them all, about his desire to make amends through this symbolic gathering. But beneath the words was unmistakable threat. The door to the dining room was locked. Armed overseers stood outside, and the enslaved understood that they were not guests, but captives in this grotesque theater of the coroner's design. Ruth sat at the head of the table opposite Wainwright, her children on either side of her face carefully blank. The other sat mechanically, responding when required, maintaining the performance that survival demanded. Young Thomas vomited from fear and tension, the sound echoing in the candle-lit room. Hannah wept silently. Old Jacob closed his eyes as though in prayer, perhaps hoping that when he opened them the nightmare would have passed. As midnight approached, Colonel Wainwright rose and walked to the fireplace. From the mantel, he retrieved a pistol, a dueling weapon that had belonged to his father. The room froze. The colonel held the weapon loosely, examining it in the firelight as though seeing it for the first time. Then he spoke his final words, a statement recorded by Hannah, who survived to testify during a legal investigation. I have loved wrongly and understood too late. I have made you witnesses to my failure and my repentance. Remember that I could not escape the prison of my birth. The single shot that followed was precise and immediately fatal. Colonel Thaddeus Wainwright collapsed before the fireplace, the pistol falling from his hand, blood spreading across the expensive carpet. The enslaved community sat in stunned silence for several seconds before Moses moved, crossing to the body, confirming death, then slowly unlocking the dining room door. The overseers outside, hearing the shot, rushed in to find their master dead, and the enslaved gathered around the table in mute testimony to whatever had transpired. The children born into slavery, like Ruth, Samuel, and Lily, inherited a world shaped by trauma and violence, but also by their parents' resistance and survival. The skills Ruth taught them, the literacy they acquired through clandestine means, the knowledge of how to navigate a world designed to destroy them. These were forms of wealth that no master could confiscate, no sale could erase. When freedom finally came, it was incomplete and compromised, followed by decades of violent backlash and systematic oppression. but the generation of formerly enslaved people who lived to see emancipation carried with them the lessons of survival, the strategies that had preserved them through the worst of slavery. And these became the foundation for continued resistance and gradual progress. The historical record of American slavery is filled with stories like Ruth's, narratives of psychological complexity, strategic resistance, and moral courage that complicate simplistic understandings of the institution. These stories were preserved despite systematic efforts to erase them, passed down through families, recorded by sympathetic listeners during Reconstruction and the early 20th century, slowly assembled into a counter-narrative that challenged the Lost Coast mythology and the romantic vision of the Old South. Each testimony, each preserved memory, each story like that of the macabre dinners at Ashwood Manor represents a victory against forgetting, a refusal to allow history to be sanitized and simplified. We who inherit this history carry the responsibility of remembering fully, of refusing both the romanticism that denies slavery's horror and the simplification that denies enslaved people's agency. Ruth was neither a passive victim nor a superhero. She was a woman trapped in an impossible situation who made calculated decisions to protect her children and preserve her own dignity within the narrow margins available to her. Her victory was incomplete, her suffering was real, and the system that oppressed her continued long after Colonel Wainwright's blood stained the carpet of his dining room. But she survived, she preserved her children, and she ensured that her story would be remembered. The legacy of slavery extends far beyond the years 1619 to 1865. It shapes contemporary America in ways both obvious and subtle, from wealth disparities rooted in stolen labor to cultural trauma passed down through generations to the continued struggle over whose stories get told and whose voices get told and whose voices get heard. Stories like Ruth's matter not as historical curiosities, but as evidence of how power operates, how resistance functions, and how human beings maintain their humanity even in systems designed to destroy it. They remind us that moral reckoning cannot be avoided through silence or forgotten through the passage of time, that history makes demands on the present, and that understanding the past is essential to creating a more just future. These stories reveal what the South preferred to forget, that slavery was not a paternalistic system of mutual obligation, but a framework of absolute power exercised through violence and maintained through terror. They show that enslaved people were not content or docile, but constantly engaged in resistance, using every tool available to them, physical rebellion when possible, psychological warfare when necessary, strategic compliance when survival required it. They demonstrate that the slave-holding class was not noble or honorable, but complicit in a system that destroyed souls, families, and human potential on a scale almost incomprehensible. And they provide that individual gestures of recognition or remorse, like Colonel Wainwright's terrible dinners, were meaningless in the face of slavery's structural violence. If you have been moved by Ruth's story, if you recognize the importance of preserving and sharing these testimonies of suffering and survival, subscribe to Shadows of the South and help us continue the work of excavating buried stories and bearing witness to the truth. Comment below with your thoughts on how Ruth's resistance speaks to broader patterns of agency and survival under oppression, and share this story with others who need to understand the full complexity of America's slaveholding past. These narratives must not be forgotten, must not be sanitized, and must continue to inform our understanding of justice, power, and human dignity.